Loading. And we are live. And if we're not, somebody please interrupt me as I'm not speaking into space.
We're
But
live.
we are live. Yay. Well, welcome everybody to the latest episode of Aeon Byte Live. This is episode 23, and it is our Halloween special that we have been doing for the last few years. And it's been a great success, and I think this is the first time we'll be doing on Aeon Byte on YouTube live. And we've got we've got Batman with us. Hey, Batman, how's it going?
I'm Batman.
Yes. A man of words, a man, a lot of words, of course. But with us, we have just 2 weeks ago, we had Scott Smith here at the Virtual Alexandria, and he has materialized again, full of gnosis, full of tricks or treats, and me full of cliches. Scott, welcome back.
With my authentic costume.
There you go. And with us too, always a pleasure to have back Sandra Wells. How are you doing tonight, Sandra? Great to have you on.
Great, thank you.
Awesome. Well, people are starting to go into the chat room. So a little house cleaning first. Something I need to remind everybody, or those who use our private RSS feed at AB Prime, Vance will be changing the password on Halloween night, or more like All Saints Day. So please, last time when we changed the password, I got all these angry emails, and because, well, people couldn't get into their private RSS feed. So please, on November 1st, simply go to thegodabovegod.com on the same page where you find all the instructions to the private RSS feed, and please update your password. I'll try to remind on emails and later on this show. Another thing, that's really it for the house cleaning. Thanks everybody for showing up, and again, please support this show. We've been doing, it's probably been the best year for Aeon Byte. I've been experimenting, doing some different things, bringing some amazing guests, and the guests are only going to get better with this fall. Some controversial shows, some incredible world-renowned guests. It's just going to be a lot of fun. So thank you for being here, and please keep supporting in any way you can. Also, yes, for Scott, I should mention, Scott is the author of God Reconsidered. Good book I've read about 2 or 3 times, and we're going to touch upon this book tonight. And for those of you too who want to support, maybe you can't support with shekels, you can't support with subscriptions, but you can always buy me books like Voices of Gnosticism. So many ways to support this show. Some people always they will donate or give gifts. I have an Amazon wish list. Like, I just got some cool headsets from DJ, the amazing DJ. Haven't tried them on yet, but I will use them to mix the next show. So I think that's enough for promotions, I suppose. I feel like I'm forgetting something really important. Oh, yes, of course, the rules. As always, we will be looking at the forum here on YouTube. If you have questions, please either write them in all caps, put a lot of questions mark, and Vance and I will get to them. Since it's Halloween special, if you have questions, even for Vance or myself, feel free to let them rip. And as always, if you do the super chats, which is donating money, you will definitely be put at the top of the queue, because it goes to support this blasphemy called Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio. And I think I'm delirious because of this cold that I can't seem to shake. Damn those little viruses, those little archons we call viruses. But enough of my dribble. Let's get to the show tonight. A lot of cool topics. So we'll start with you, Scott Smith. Obviously, you've honored the show many times. We've discussed a lot of your chapters in your book, God Reconsidered, a lot of topics from Mormonism to addiction recovery, all through sort of a modern Gnostic view or lenses. We've covered one of the thrusts of your book, God Reconsidered, Scott, is sort of countering these what Jeff Kripal calls them professional debunkers, not even real skeptics, professional debunkers and militant skeptics and atheists who refuse to look at the evidence for things like ESP, UFOs, near-death experience, which there is a lot of solid science behind it. Doesn't mean you have to, believe it or anything like that. But also another thing that these professional debunkers really hate or go against is alternative medicine like acupuncture, chiropractic, herbal therapies, and so forth. But tell us what your take is on this, Scott, since both you and Sandra have backgrounds in this holistic medicine and nutritional field.
Right. So it's a little known fact that I'm the world's leading authority on the similarities between hardline skeptics and fundamentalists. So I've had a lot of experience since the book came out in 2014 dealing with them on Facebook and stuff. And they're remarkably similar in many ways. Now, one could argue that the so-called skeptics are maybe more intelligent, or they are have a greater knowledge of history or something like that. But the personality traits are actually quite similar. They resort to authority a lot. I have tried to get people to read one of the first chapters of my book, the one on ESP, because it's a very easy thing to demonstrate that there's massive evidence for this. And atheists like Freud just accepted telepathy as something that was natural. And a lot of the research was done in the Soviet Union, which of course was officially atheist. So, but you cannot get them to actually either read my book or my sources. What they'll do is they'll go on Wikipedia and they'll pick a source like Dean Radin or Scott Roger or something like that, and they'll say, well, Wikipedia says, they're fakes, they're not scientific, And I've talked to Dean Radin, who wrote The Conscious Universe about this in his more recent book, Real Magic. And he says, yeah, he's tried to engage these guys, and they're very irrational and convinced that they're right. So how this segues into alternative medicine is that if you read the skeptics magazines like Skeptical Inquirer and The Skeptic and so forth, you'll find that they're often raging against anything that they don't think is scientific. And the fundamental problem is, as Thomas Kuhn pointed out in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, is it's just a fact in every academic field that the guys who are teaching, the guys who control the state boards of any professional group, they're really about 2 generations behind the cutting edge evidence. They're teaching what they practiced, what they learned, and their first line of students are doing the same. And it takes about 2 generations to die off before the conventional wisdom changes. Now, both Sandra and I, as you mentioned, have a background in this. I've run what's now called an integrative medical clinic. I was an editor at Vegetarian World. I was an assistant to several famous nutritionists. I wrote a book on natural methods of healing cancer. And the first thing I'd like to say is that if you listen to the propaganda from the official medical boards and stuff, you would think there were no real doctors practicing this stuff. In fact, India has some of the best medical schools in the world. When I was living in Germany in the 1970s, they had what's now known as fully integrative medicine. You could go into a pharmacy and ask them about homeopathy, which most American doctors have never heard of. You could go to a doctor and he had a physician's desk reference on herbs. And maybe that explains why the fact that the Asians and Europeans are much higher in their preventive medicine and health outcomes. We are number 39 among developed nations in the outcome per dollar spent. And I always say to my doctor friends, my conventional doctor friends, who invented this system? Maybe the doctors and the pharmacy companies. The the reality is that the Mayo Clinic, the Cleveland Clinic, the more progressive places include more and more ideas. The Germans said, hey, we're just pragmatic. We use whatever works. We don't care whether it can be proven. Very recently, there was a study done of 400 common medical practices. None of them actually worked. So, you know, this notion that conventional medicine is proven is just absolutely false. Now, there are problems trying to pin down the proof in nutrition because, first of all, a lot of the trials use too small amounts or infrequent amounts of the substances. Secondly, how do you control for honesty? People go home, they claim they're following a certain diet, and you know they're filling out their form and everything like that. They're probably gorging on cake or something like that, and not taking their vitamins or whatever it is. It is hard to control, but there's a very good book on diet myths out by John Mackey, who founded Whole Foods, called The Whole Foods Diet. Wrote it with a couple of doctors that people want to read. It's got lots of footnotes for those who are skeptical. More importantly is Prescription for Nutritional Healing. If anybody wants the scientific evidence for nutritional supplements and other things, Phyllis Balch, B-A-L-C-H, has this book that sold 8 million copies. It's used by alternative medical clinics. And she goes into great detail about the amounts that need to be used and the frequency. You pick any subject like cancer, and there's probably 20 pages in it. So I mention all this because there are hundreds of doctors or thousands of doctors in the US who have had lots of personal experience. The fact that we have such terrible health outcomes suggests that maybe we ought to try something different. In fact, you know, Hippocrates said, let food be thy medicine, and they have completely gotten away from what really makes sense. Now, finally, I'd like to just mention something about the evidence for two controversial areas. One is acupuncture. Now, it's used as an anesthetic during childbirth and for a whole host of things, of course, in Asia. But it's also used in veterinary medicine. So you can't simply say it's psychosomatic. There is actually, contrary to what doctors believe, evidence for the Asian energy lines. There's a book out by James Oshman called Energy Medicine, where he goes into great detail. There's a new technology that has been installed in the largest South Korean hospital called Life Vessel. It's all over the US now. Nobody's ever heard of it, and the company doesn't really like to make medical claims. But I'm telling you, Sandra and I went to see the prototype of this in 2005, and it resets the autonomic nervous system. And we talked to people who suffered from any kind of disease you can imagine. They had a lot of top name brand doctors come in to check it out, and it's based on the Asian medicine idea. The other thing that sounds wacky to conventional, what I call the medical inquisition that runs the state board, and they try to put out of business a lot of alternative doctors, is homeopathy. It's a 300-year-old alternative treatment. It uses something called cell salts. Now, people can say, oh, it's psychosomatic, but again, widely used in veterinary trials. They did a meta study of 52 livestock trials in Europe. 26 of the animals showed significant improvement, 22 no effect. You could say that about a lot of medicines. I'm now in my semi-retirement as a journalist doing a little bit of nutritional consulting, and I've had lots of pilots tell me that the homeopathic jet lag is the only thing that works, and they've tried everything, so it can't just be psychosomatic.
Wow. And yeah, I mean, like you said, the proof is in the pudding. What was the statistic that the United States is last? I know child mortality, we're terrible. Yeah. Life expectancy, we're dropping really bad. What are some, I mean, what's the skeptics want data? There's some bad data that we suck. So, but.
Well, the insurance companies are starting to run the doctors. I mean, my own family doctor has told me so directly. I won't mention his name, but they're telling them what they can prescribe. They are telling them the limits of what they can do. and so forth. But you know, the AMA has accepted acupuncture to some degree. I don't know if you've kept up on that, Scott, but I just saw a position paper. I was looking, and they've accepted under at least certain conditions.
Can't hear you, Miguel. Can you hear me?
Scott. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, because I couldn't hear Miguel. Miguel was talking. I couldn't hear him. I can hear you, though.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I just mentioned AMA has accepted acupuncture to some degree. So I was wondering if you'd read anything or have an update on that.
I did hear actually somebody who was a spokesman for the AMA about 6 years ago saying they were astonished by the findings in alternative medicine. They were hoping to come out, with some negative evidence. And I brought this up to some skeptics, and they poo-pooed it. And they said, nope, AMA's position hasn't changed. So you can't persuade people that don't want to believe something.
Jesus, yeah, I accidentally muted myself. I was just saying, what's the old saying? Doctors never get colds, because they also keep the good stuff for themselves. They got to keep us always in a state of sickness so they can make money. So it's quite a racket, but that's why we need to find this gnosis. Yeah, was it homotherapy for jet lag? I'm going to try that next time I travel.
Right, homeopathy, right. Oops, what's this AAO? There's the position paper.
Is that you, Van, sharing?
Yes, I imagine. Or the AMA is possibly.
Yeah, Vance is sharing his screen. How cool. And he's on mute.
Yep.
Vance has taken over the show.
Okay. Well, we can still have a conversation. Sandra has some ideas on this stuff.
Yeah, let us know, Sandra. What is it? Tell us your wisdom on this.
Well, my mother and I had a difficult relationship early in life. And then later on, she got to trust me, and when she got diagnosed with stage 2 bladder cancer, she turned to Scott and myself for a little help. We had just gotten back from 10 days at the world's most successful cancer clinic in Mexico. Scott was writing a book about it. And patients told us there that the doctors had told patients they only had a few months to live. They came there and said 10, 15 years later, they're still alive and kicking. My mother decided to go, and we took her. I took her, Scott took her, and she was there for 3 weeks with very avant-garde treatment, really top of the line, fabulous stuff. Came back, and when she had to have the bladder cancer removed surgically, the doctor who took it out came out of the operating room with his eyes wide open. He was amazed. He said, how did you guys kill a cancer that big in 3 weeks? What happened? Well, he said, okay, from now on, we took the cancer out. She's going to be fine, but she's got to take this injection every 3 months to keep her from coming back. Well, this went on for a couple of years. She did very well. And then when she went out of state to live, the new doctors out of state poo-pooed the whole thing. So eventually the cancer came back and she passed away. But for a while there, it was fabulous. And of course, she had a great result at the cancer clinic, which had been, poo-pooed by everybody here. It was quite the experience, and I never forgot how the doctors were so amazed at what happened.
Yeah, although the doctor did say, tell her to keep doing what she's doing, but don't tell the other doctors I told you that.
And what was the clinic again?
Oh, it's a, weirdly enough, the U.S. government put a lot of pressure to close it, because the doctor who ran it was on the San Diego side. They spent 2 years going through his trash trying to find insurance fraud. It was called Hospital Santa Monica, and we got the book done. The reason he wanted it is because they had a much, much higher rate than Americans for putting into remission 4th stage metastatic cancer after it spread to other organs. They had a 53% 5-year survival rate. And at the time, there was only 0.5%, I think, or maybe it was 5% actually, in the US. So they wanted to get the book out so that patients would come down earlier and they would have a better recovery rate. But he decided he was being so harassed that he just decided not to publish the book, and he turned the clinic over to the Mexican doctors, and we lost track of it. Eventually it went out of business. But there's something called the Cancer Control Society in Los Angeles, and they refer people all the time down to the clinics. There's a whole medical strip down there offering alternatives.
Awesome. What's somebody saying in the chat room? I'm gonna take C60. Cole's gone. What is C60, Hiker 9? Because I could use some. I've had a cold for like a week and it is slowly going away. Now all the kids have it.
Yeah, after the show, we will tell you what you can do. So legal and illegal.
I'll try anything right now. But awesome. And you were also talking about Dean Radin's Real Magic, which is an awesome book. It's just chock full of well, incredible studies on the paranormal, on the power of the human brain, and very much also historical views of people who defied all rational science. And tell us about your insights on this, Scott.
Well, I wrote the first article about what had happened with his book, The Conscious Universe. He had been teaching at Las Vegas Magazine, and then he got fired under pressure. And the story is, I told it in Las Vegas Magazine, and also I summarized it in the first chapter of my book. Radin went on to found the Institute of Noetic Sciences and take a kind of a practical approach to applying ESP. But we've been in touch because he conducts conferences, and he has nothing but disdain over the rabid skeptics. I quoted him a great courses professor named David Kyle Johnson, who's famously skeptic, and I was involved in a commentary battle with him about one of his courses where he was dismissing, any kind of paranormal stuff. And again, he said, I've been told that this is nonsense. And he said, look on Wikipedia, Radin has his experiments didn't work, all kinds of stuff. He would not read the book, of course. And so what Radin did is he referred me to one of his response to one of these skeptical reviews of his book Supernormal, which goes back a few years, and he went point by point through the skeptics' criticisms and showed this guy didn't know what he was talking about, because Radin was a Bell engineer, very hardcore, really good at designing tests, and he showed how great the results were in terms of what was expected. But the book reviewer, of course, didn't understand this stuff. And so he's tried to push back on these skeptics. So I doubt that his new book, Real Magic, is going to change anything. But as you said, it's full of chapters like the one on levitation, where there were repeated mass witnesses. At one point, one of these guys, they tried to hold him down because he kept levitating inconveniently for the Catholic Church. And
John of Cupertino, I believe.
Yeah, I think so. So they, and I think Teresa of Avila was always kind of involuntarily levitating. So the book is full of updates on ESP and other seemingly paranormal things, which of course there's really no supernatural. There are just natural laws we don't understand, which is, it's kind of weird. I mean, I'm reminded that the skeptics are kind of like the scientific conventional wisdom at the end of the 19th century, where they had figured everything out except that ether thing. And they were about to wrap things up when Einstein came along. The notion that, we don't even know what dark matter and dark energy are, which occupies most of the universe. It's only been a century since Einstein came along, and we're still trying to understand what he said. The absurd closed-mindedness of hardcore skeptics is just really inexplicable. Marcello Truzzi, who's the former editor of the Skeptical Inquirer, which is the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, as they now call themselves. They used to have an acronym for their original name that came off as PsyCop, and I guess somebody said that didn't sound too open-minded, but he wrote a book called The Blue Sense, and he said, scientists are not paragons of rationality, objectivity, or open-mindedness and humility that many of them might like others to believe. And so, Radin has run into this constantly, and I tell the story in the book about how Nature magazine in England would not allow even a Nobel laureate to write a response to a critical review. It was only after the editor was fired about a year later that finally the new editor let letters be printed. They do not want public debate. You know, they think that anybody who believes in this stuff is a dangerous spreader of superstition.
Awesome. Somebody in the chat room was saying, read Stenger's takedown of Raiden. It's spot on and pretty brutal. Are you familiar with that, Scott?
Never heard of the guy, and I've dealt with Dean Radin for many, many years. I'm guessing, I've talked to Radin about these things that get posted on Wikipedia and stuff like that. They don't know what they're talking about. Radin, he's very accessible. If somebody wants to email me or him, I can show the review in Supernormal and his response to it. It's very, very scientific. Every critic that I've ever seen, it's not spot on. They really don't know what they're talking about. And if you read Conscious Universe, I'll give you another example from his new book, Real Magic. When you talk to the skeptics, they'll always say, oh, levitation's nothing. We do that in stage all the time. Yeah, not in the 1500s where you've got thousands of people standing around and there's no stage. The irony is, again, ESP, which the critics absolutely deny exists, is well proven by atheists in the Soviet Union. That's what got Dean Radin interested, So, something, every critic I've ever met relies on some guy who says he read a book. I would challenge anybody to send me the so-called review, and I will send it to Radin, and I'm sure he's got a very lengthy response that he'll send back. This has happened many, many times. And so I also have heard, Scott Rogo is criticized by other parapsychologists. Yes. Has there ever been an author who hasn't been making enemies every time he talks and writes a book? This notion that somebody has taken him apart, it's just more propaganda from that side. And I'm sure that they would say the same thing about my chapter on UFOs, where I show that the skeptics' authorities lie repeatedly when you go back and you check their sources.
That is true. And again, for the audience, if you have a question, please put a lot of question marks behind it, and Vance or I will get to it for Sandra or Scott, or even Vance or myself if you have a question tonight about these topics or other things, since it is our Halloween special. And Vance, anything on your end you want to talk, comment, or anything from the audience you want to share?
Well, we have a skeptic in the chat room, Frank Feldman. So he's
cool,
dishing out the authorities say it's all bunk. So whether it is or not, it's people claiming.
Read it for yourself, man.
And one thing I'll say is this is just like the Gnostics, right? With the church fathers scolding and saying, oh, your stuff is no good and you're wrong and we have the track to God. And, the scientists have their own religion, I guess. But now, one thing I just saw about Dean Radin was they criticized him. He had these famous, the Princeton eggs, and he seemed to show us this, a statistical correlation between what people were, people's efforts to influence the eggs and the changes in the random numbers. And so what the skeptic says, well, you need to go beyond the statistics and explain how the mind does this, and then test that explanation. Well, they're not denying that the effect was there. They're just, it's always one step further, before you know it, there's just no end to it. If people don't want to believe something, they'll always find one more step that somebody has to take before you can prove it. Well, the scientists can't prove that consciousness exists. So what can you say?
Yeah, or like Scott said, dark matter. Most gene science is completely unknown. We know very little, and I think the way to know more is to be humble, like scientists were. Those that have made great breakthroughs, who some of them were basically like Einstein, and some of the others were basically mystics, humble mystics who saw who use their imagination and their incredible intelligence to break through. So, but again,
I'd like to add
sure.
one thing here on that. I just finished Yuval Harari's Homo Deus, and he's most famous for his book Sapiens. And much of it is about, he's a humanist himself, but he said any humanist, any scientist, any secularist who doesn't think humanism is a religion doesn't understand it. And if they think it's a safe religion, they don't understand it. And he goes through a lot of examples of how the different types of humanism. I've recently, just this week, I answered something on an atheist website, and I said, you know, if you listen to Richard Dawson, he blames Stalin's, no, he blames Hitler's murders on the fact that he was raised Catholic. And I thought that, you know, people would laugh at that. But no, the atheists came back and said, hey, when I started bringing up Mao Zedong and Stalin, they said, well, Stalin grew up Russian Orthodox, and Mao was raised a Buddhist. You know, if you want to define atheism as always virtuous, then yes, they never kill anybody. You know, that damn Buddhist Mao Zedong was responsible for those 45 to 70 million, you know. So these are circular arguments like you can have with fundamentalists.
Yeah, plus at the end of the day, you can argue whether Mao or Stalin or Hitler, whatever their religion was, but their governments were anti-theist. Their governments wanted to suppress any form of spirituality, any form of true humanism, and they did an excellent job at it. So, yeah, going against religion also usually results in a great catastrophe, whether you're persecuting the Gnostics and starting the Crusades, or you're wiping out Jews and Catholics like the National Socialists. But same as it ever was, this is the game of Saturn. This is the world of the Demiurge. So why don't we get to you, Sandra? And when you were on our Halloween special, when you honored the Virtual Alexandria in 2016, you discussed your work in ritual magic and expressed skepticism about the abilities of most of those who claim to be magicians. Do you think Rayton's ideas could help the average person to do anything magical or supernatural?
Well, he's very, very well informed, and I liked his book very much. I do think it's much more difficult than one makes out. There is levels of understanding how difficult it is to reprogram. There's Bruce Lipton, The Biology of Belief, and he's a quantum physicist who says that the subconscious mind is 1 million times bigger than the conscious mind, and we are programmed at birth with a script given to us by our teachers, parents, etc. So we're working under the illusion that we have much more free will than we do. We're working with a flawed situation to begin with. So when you're starting to work with your program, instead of erasing best you can the chatter that's your mind working by getting into the alpha state, so you can re-visualize what you need to change your life, it's a difficult thing to do. There's a fabulous creative energy book by what's his name?
Creative Imagery.
What's his name? Creative Energy.
Fessler.
Fessler, yeah. Who goes into vivid detail about the levels of visualization like nobody ever does, like 1,000 different shades of gray, the rustle of wind, the leaves. It's so intense, the contrast of colors. So it takes a great deal of work to do this right, and to do it as a ritual every day, to reprogram the conditioning that one has. I think that it's much more difficult than one ever thinks, and it takes a great deal of effort and energy. And I think people are under the impression they can just do something like The Secret or something silly and change their life. It's very difficult to do, indeed, on that.
Very interesting. And I don't remember, was it you or Scott who'd met the Tibetan goddess, Green Tara, I believe?
Green Tara, it's me.
Yeah, tell us about that. I mean, I know you're into shamanism too.
Yeah, Green Tara is an entity that my teacher used. That was his deity. That's not a person, but a presence. To prepare to be able to experience Green Tara, I swear, yeah, I had been doing 4 to 5 hours a day of meditation that he required. He was a very tough master. He wanted 8 hours a day. I had to earn a living. And in those 4 or 5 hours a day, I had to visualize using a mantra, Green Tara, upside down, sideways, inside out, stretching every which way you could imagine. So when I had the opportunity to experience her as a presence, I could really feel the presence. And I'm sure there are other entities available with the same situation. One has to be totally prepared. I put a great deal of work into it and still never reached his level, of course. He was the real thing. So when I said that, very few people can, they all say they do this work and they write great books. It doesn't mean they can cut the mustard. It doesn't mean they can really do it. It takes a lifetime of work. He's been working with this type of thing since he was 13 years old, and I was only an assistant. I was only the vessel. He was the real deal, and that was the reason that I felt so strongly about it. But the experience was so overpowering. The world changed itself. The world disappeared, and there's nothing there but pure experience at a level I could not describe in words. It was that intense.
That's wonderful. Yeah. Yes, I love that pure experience. And some hiker, you keep talking C60, good and cheap. What are you talking about, man? What is the secret? Is this like an explosive? Well, better not say that on YouTube, or else we'll get back. Don't say explosives or stuff like that. Al Akbar. No, just kidding. Actually, why don't we take an audience question? I think I see Daniel McCoy.
Yeah, he was wondering whether we could discuss the topic of divine madness, how it relates to shamanism.
Yeah, well, Scott could relate. You're pretty insane.
Yes. Yes, I think anybody tuning into the show is by worldly definition crazy. And, that's why the Gnostics got persecuted out of business. That's why the Inquisition was set up. And thank goodness there's no persecution today.
Only in social media.
Yeah, I'm not an authority, thank goodness, on divine madness, but I will say this. Increasingly, after the book has come out, as I've interacted with readers and studied more and more, I do have kind of a more shamanistic approach to the great metaphysical issues, like why do people incarnate? Why is there not more powerful intervention from the divine if there is a God? I think that one of the strengths of dualism and Gnosticism is that it recognizes the fundamental flaw in the idea of traditional religions, that either there is an all-powerful God in the traditional sense, a good force, or effectively handing that over to karma. Everything is just. We, as the saying goes, it's all good. We get what's coming to us. It's karma, and there are no accidents and all that kind of stuff. It's actually just the opposite of that. Reality is extraordinarily chaotic, and this applies to metaphysical reality too. It's very clear that there are a wide variety of so-called deities that are pushing different religions. I mean, Sandra and I have spent time in Saudi Arabia. There seems to be a pretty good argument that Muhammad could not have written the Quran, or at least memorized it and passed it on what he heard, because it's very beautiful Arabic. And I know from having worked with UFO Magazine that there's a book out called Alien Identities, which is about how the Hindu gods appear. And I'm close to the Krishnas. We've been to India, and I think that kind of a notion that there are many different powers that are intervening in our reality, but they're not that powerful any more than God is, the positive, the negative, the neutral. So we did do a show with the first one with Sandra a few years ago called Shamanistic Gnosticism. If anybody wants to, I guess you have to say YouTube that rather than Google it. But there is a lot of truth. I think if you kind of blend that together with traditional Gnosticism, involving the Christian Mass and some of the theological ideas, you're coming closer to the truth than anything else out there. As far as the madness goes, I couldn't say. I'm not the one who took Sandoz LSD like Sandra did with Timothy Leary, and somebody then known as Richard Alpert before his reincarnation as Ram Dass. You know, she knows about the divine madness more than I do. But anyway, that's kind of my take on shamanism.
Yes, you've been in the occult esoteric circle, Sandra, for a long time. Who is like one of the most spiritual people you ever met? Maybe who's one of the darkest souls you've ever met?
My teacher.
Both.
Both.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
I knew him. Yes.
I once heard about this Ross Peterson that was similar to Edgar Casey, and I searched for him for a couple of years, couldn't find him. One day, there he is on the cover of Fate magazine that Scott used to write for. I said, Scott, you've got to write to the magazine, find him right away. So Scott did. We found a writer of that article, and the article said, I'll put you in touch with him. If he wants to get in touch with you, he'll call you. He did call me. This is this Ross Peterson. And would you believe he was like Edgar Casey? I flew all the way down to Michigan to see him, had a 15-minute session with him, a consultation where he hired a conductor, because he goes out in the world just like Edgar Casey and does a search for you. And I asked him about my teacher. I said to him, tell me, is this particular teacher, does he have a dark element? Because I was kind of concerned. And he said, well, he walks many paths of the rainbow. And he went into description about Scott, about my personal life, about my health issues. And I have a tape, I have a 90-minute, I have a 50-minute tape of that interview with Ross Peterson. Could never find him again, found him once. And never could find him again. He disappeared as usual.
Yeah, she also knew Werner Erhard and you met Aldous Huxley.
Oh,
you had tea with him one time.
He was very, very young, 18 years old.
Yeah, a lot of interesting characters. And she was in Gurdjieff
I was in the Gurdjieff Foundation for a long time. That's what that was one of my very first interests. I thought he was a very, very way out, fabulous man, and I loved the whole group. Eventually, I got kind of disinterested, but for a long time, it was really a main focus. Yeah,
awesome. That's awesome. I think we have a question. Hope you don't think I'm getting ahead of you, Vance. I just see a question pop up over here. But let's see, Sandra, in your opinion, is ceremony part and parcel with doing magic? While I was in the OTO, I found ceremony very mundane. That's from Ray McKenzie.
Very what?
Mundane, worldly, and kind of boring.
The ceremonial work that I found looking at groups is mundane. They really don't have the power. Words don't cut it. Anybody can recite incantations, pretend they're this and that, doesn't mean anything. I met people that wrote books that were so famous. I met them personally, did some work with them, found them zero power. Doesn't mean because they wrote a book and because they say they can do it, they can do it. So they are mundane. Most of them don't have it.
What about ritual in general? Do you think we need ritual for altered state of consciousness?
If we could, yeah, of course. If this is the whole secret to everything. Ritual is the best.
But you just have to find what works for you, what
works for you, and who to back you, and who to work with you, and how much intent you have, and how much time you can put in.
Yeah, and I would say that also Gnosticism honors ritual. The Mass is a magical rite. And Heller wrote a book on that. If you go on gnosis.org, he's given lectures on kind of a Jungian interpretation of the importance of the Mass as a kind of a ceremony of personal transformation. And I think that very unusual aspect of modern Gnosticism shows that it's not just kind of a humanistic invention by a bunch of heretics who, the new Protestants, and Bishop Heller of Ecclesia Gnostica is big on this, where he says, the Protestants really lost a lot by de-emphasizing ritual and all that goes with it. And I think it was one of the major teachers and founders of Theosophy, Charles Ledbetter, who was very psychically sensitive, and he said that wherever the Mass was performed, he could see psychic energy building up in it. And so it, and I come from a Mormon background where I can say that the Mormon temple ceremony was very impressive, beyond kind of the rational learning level, and it's all about kind of the path to godhood. And so ritual, I think, is underestimated by modern humans.
Amen. Vance, do you have a question, comment, or anything from the audience you'd like to share?
Yeah, well, I have a couple of things.
Go ahead.
So they were talking about AI, so maybe we'll get into that in a bit. But so I had something to say about ritual. Years ago, when I was in the Rosicrucian order, I had the good fortune to live in San Jose, and they had a big feast one time. And Rosicrucian thing is a mail order thing mostly. They send you the monographs, you study them, you write letters back, all sorts of stuff. But anyway, I went to one of these feasts that they had, an autumn harvest feast, I think it was. And it was a ritual and a ceremony. And it was the most horrible thing it was like a funeral. It was like so dead. And I appreciate it, the room is beautiful and the ritual had a lot of stuff in it, but there was no energy from the people there. And I'll never, ever forget that. And I'm not speaking against ritual, but it brings to my point, which is a ritual is another communication. It's an interaction. So if it doesn't mean anything to you, if somebody's speaking another language you don't understand, it's going to be boring and meaningless. You have to have some background, right? You have to know what the symbols are. And so it's like anything else. If you know the language, the visual language of a ritual, then it can be very wonderful. But if you don't know what's going on, then it's just confusing. That's my opinion.
Cool. And just shifting gears a bit. I think you mentioned you just read Sam Harris's Waking Up. What's your opinion on this work, Scott?
Yeah, it's a really remarkable book from a hardcore atheist. Sam Harris is the more reasonable among all the well-known authors like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and so forth. It's actually a book that Gnostics should read, because what he talks about is a certain type of Buddhist meditation where he gains some inner peace. And he said, quite frankly, the atheists he knows are, full of rage. They don't have inner peace. And I would actually say that something happened to most hardcore militant atheists and so-called skeptics early in life that caused them to be on such a crusade, because it's not the reasonable approach to the big questions that should be pursued. But in any event, he, I think, rightly points out that a lot of the enthusiasm over kind of what I would call New Age quantum physics, like the interpretation of how the mind supposedly creates reality and stuff, that that's called the Copenhagen interpretation, that's one of 100 different explanations, and that there's too much of this kind of Deepak Chopra kind of interpretation that Eastern religion is in full harmony with quantum physics, and of course he doesn't believe that. But it's a book worth reading, because he kind of goes through his personal struggle of how he started to take meditation seriously. Where I think the book is flawed is, and Yuval Harari is the same way in Homo Deus, is they are absolutely convinced that there's no evidence for near-death experiences. It all can be explained away by biochemistry. And they both are arguing that this is evident. This is, you might say, counter evidence that there's no self, which of course is a classic Buddhist idea. Now, I argue against this in the chapter that's posted on godreconsidered.com. And I think that I'm not persuaded by their arguments that because the self is complicated, we have a conscious, a subconscious, a left and right brain, and so forth and so on. Yes, we are complicated beings. We can fool ourselves. Yes, we are divinely mad. I mean, anybody who has read a book like Harville Hendricks' Getting the Love You Want, which is Oprah's favorite book on relationships, understands human beings are a mess. Aside from the 400 emotional and mental diseases that Jehovah apparently gave us for our personal growth or something, we are incompetent. Most parents should be required to get a driver's license before they have kids, and or at least something a little harder than a driver's license. The traditional religious notion that we're put here in order to grow and learn and, you know, eventually decide which religion is true and so forth is utter nonsense, even forgetting about the fact that most of the 108 billion people who have ever supposedly incarnated never had a chance to read scripture or find the truth. Most of humanity has spent their lives farming or, you know, just trying to get to work. And if they have any free time, you know, they're now fooling around on Twitter or something like that. I mean, there's like zero time for a spiritual life. So we are the Gnostics are sympathetic to our brothers, the atheists, who think they look at conventional religion and say, how could anybody believe this stuff? And so Harari and Sam Harris are in that thing. And I'm not persuaded by their arguments about the self at all. But their main thing as well, that we know that no individual survives death. Well, in my chapter 3 and on my Facebook page for God Reconsidered, I have all my blogs posted. I believe it's my 4th blog. I go into the new evidence for near-death experiences. If you look at this carefully, you realize that the skeptics don't know what they're talking about when it comes to biochemistry. It's the exact opposite. There's another book out, which I refer to in God Reconsidered, called Best Evidence. He shows that often deathbed visions, the biochemistry, the drugs, and all this stuff, it should not produce visions at all. So there's a lot of evidence for near-death experience. And if you accept the fact that people survive, then it completely trashes their notion that there is no individual. And the reason I also mention this is because waking up is about a certain type of Buddhism. I mean, you know, if you don't happen to know about this particular little sect, then you know, I don't know what that does to Sam's arguments, but he basically says, you know, you have to kind of pursue this for years and years and years and do this certain type of Buddhist meditation, right? And then you come to the enlightenment that there's no self. So I do think, though, that people will get a lot out of waking up, regardless of the flaws.
Interesting. I didn't even know he had a book out. I just haven't been keeping attention. I think in the chat, Jason Chambers asked, would the Demiurge be an atheist? I would say yes. I mean, that's his call. There is no God but me. So,
well, he believes in himself. Doesn't he believe in himself?
Low self-esteem, very low self-esteem, though. So,
you know,
he's got a lot of steam, though.
For people who say, well, how could the Demiurge not know about the higher God? Well, you could say the same thing about mortals. How can the skeptics not accept the massive evidence, anecdotal and scientific, that, you know, they can accept the 11-string universe, which is a mere theory, but they can't accept the idea there's a paranormal dimension, you know. So I think that the idea that somebody could be in one dimension and not be aware of higher dimensions, that's really the argument of the Gnostics. They said, read the Old Testament. And as one of your guests, David Brackey, said, he was convinced there really was a gnosis experience that opened their eyes, because he said, it's hard to believe that Jews would all of a sudden decide that Jehovah was evil or at least ignorant. And it's just a matter of reading the Old Testament. The Old Testament is the perfect evidence that Jehovah doesn't believe in God, because otherwise he wouldn't be doing these evil things. He thinks he can get away with it, and apparently to some extent he has. You know, the more you get into shamanism and the supernatural in general, the more it seems there are many, many different dimensions, and a lot of these spirits seem to be kind of ignorant of each other. Certainly many of them are advocating Islam and Catholicism. I grew up Mormon. The Mormons had spirits appear to them to confirm that this was the right path. So, how would they all be doing that if they were all aware of the transcendent God that Gnostics believe in?
Exactly. It's a busy universe out there. And speaking of maybe skeptics who changed their way or had an experience, there's a lot of those. Obviously, individuals like Jeff Kripal and Gary Lockman. If you read their books, there's tons of them. But one that always gets overlooked is Michael Crichton.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you know him.
Yeah.
Oh, you knew him? Wow. Tell us about him, Sandra.
We lived in the same building, and he was very tall and very good looking. And we had talked a little bit about this and that, usually about Gurdjieff. For some reason, he was interested in what I had to say for a long time. We spoke about it, and this is before he went and he wrote his book Travels. Right before that, he was a big deal. He became even a bigger deal. We spent a lot of time talking. I talked about Gurdjieff. He was fascinated by Gurdjieff for some reason. Seemed curious to me. I really didn't know much about him. I knew he was a big deal, but I didn't realize he'd become like king of the world practically. And he was extremely patient and listened carefully. I didn't find anything exciting about him particularly or whatever, just that he was good looking and tall and listened to my stories. And I had been a Playboy bunny, a few other things. So who knows what the reason was, but I did have his attention. And I met Scott right after that. And I think I told you about Crichton at that time. He read his books, and we read Travels later. That was kind of a new thing. I didn't think he'd be interested in psychics. He wrote a whole chapter on the London psychics. He was very patient, and he did find some proof. He got over his prejudice. He found some shocking revelations. One particular psychic in his book. It was very interesting. His travel book was fabulous. One of Scott's very favorite books in the world. And what did you think about it?
Yeah, it kind of sneaks up on you if you think it's just about a travel log, because this was right after his divorce, and Sandra had known him right before he started traveling the world. And the remarkable thing about it is the more he traveled, the more strange things he encountered. And he realized that his training, he was going to become a doctor. He was trained at Harvard Medical School, and then, Andromeda Strain became a bestseller. And he was a rationalist, a skeptic. But the more things he encountered in the world, the more he realized that the very kind of narrow-minded, materialistic understanding of reality made no sense at all. He had a bunch of scary experiences he recounts in the book. When he came back, one of the leading people at the Skeptics Society, I think it was the founder of it out in Pasadena, said, hey, why don't you come and tell us, you got some provocative ideas from your trips. Why don't you come and talk to us about it? So he said, sure. So he started drafting up his little talk. And eventually, the board of the Skeptics Society voted not to invite him. And he mentions this, he talks about it in the book. So he got his revenge because he made it the appendix, his speech that he was going to give to them. And what he basically says in there is that the so-called skeptics don't recognize their own bias, and they get very, very worked up if you try to explain what you have learned. For example, he mentions in the book when he was directing the Great Train Robbery in London, he decided to disguise himself and not allow any kind of body language, give away anything about his reaction. He started going around to psychics, and he went to this one blind old lady And she said, wow, there's something very disturbing about you. I see a whole bunch of black snakes making whooshing sounds, and people in top hats are going back and forth. He said that was an exact description of the film editing room for the scenes that he was working on right then. So the black snakes, he said that things like that really spooked him, because every so often he would come across things that he couldn't explain, healers around the world. So if it's a great summary of why one should be open-minded, and of course the skeptics won't read it, but it's the appendix to Travels. It's a very popular book, and it's a fun read, fascinating book. And I didn't get to know him, but I have written about him for Investors Business Daily and studied his life. Interesting guy.
Yeah, interesting about not believing. I just remembered in Dean Radin's Real Magic, he actually talks about one of the big skeptics, Michael Shermer, and he talks about how Michael Shermer had a supernatural experience where a year after somebody close to him had died, this clock that was unplugged and broken kept playing music and talk. It was basically his dead parent or something talking to him, and he admitted it was supernatural. But then guess what? Then later on, they start writing it off. Oh, it was nothing. It was in my head and all that, even though he had proof from his wife about it. So it's, but I mean, we're all humans are like that. I mean, if we want to deny something, we will deny it. I mean, if we want to go to war over something or support somebody we think is going to save us, or think that last piece of cake is not too bad for us. The human mind can make a heaven out of hell and a hell out of heaven, as the poet said. But I digress. Vance, have anything to say? Any questions from the audience? I see some question marks flying here and there in the chat room.
I see a question about Rupert Sheldrake, one of my favorites, and his theory of morphic resonance and morphic fields. So, I read The Presence of the Past. I think I read another one of his books, but I'm starting to forget. But it's very convincing, and he has scientific evidence. And Rupert Sheldrake, who I think is connected with Dean Radin too. I think they know each other. He's been interviewed many times on things like Thinking Aloud and other shows. It's the idea that on an island, when a certain number of individual animals learn a skill, all of a sudden on the other side of the island they start learning the skill. It becomes a habit. It's almost like information, like the Plato's realm of ideas. It propagates and it becomes more of a habit. So and that has implications for evolution and genetic modification, so forth. But anyway, so that's the question about I'm familiar with it. I'm sure you are, Scott, right? And Miguel, you probably heard of it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've read some books on it. Where I kind of disagree with Sheldrake and Radin and a lot of these other guys is I think that there's way too much eagerness to embrace what I would call kind of a new age interpretation, where we have very, very limited information. For example, and Radin admits that you should not interpret quantum physics and Einstein's ideas with the notion that the future is somehow kind of set because we can travel in time, and in fact Deepak Chopra has this book where he says there's no aging, and you can just turn back the clock. There's no time. Leslie Smolin, who's one of the most respected physicists, says there really is time. We have actually measured the Big Bang was about 14 billion years ago. The universe is still expanding. That involves time, or as I like to call it, sequence, for people that get hung up on the definition of time. And Stephen Hawking admitted that in theory, time could go backwards, but in this universe, so far as we can tell, it goes forward. The fact that there are many things we don't understand about physics, my attitude is, again, we just discovered this stuff. We know virtually nothing about the universe. Why don't we be patient for another 100 years? Maybe we'll have, remember what happened with Einstein. First, there's his revolution, and then quantum physics kind of rolled out over the next decades. There's just so much to discover. Why are we trying to clamp an interpretation on it? My objection also to this loose approach to the time thing, it's not understood by most people that whether it's psychics, New Agers, or those like Course in Miracles, Advaita Vedanta and others, where they say, there's only one thing. If you believe in a diverse, shamanistic, if you will, universe, where there are things that are happening in a certain sequence, then God doesn't know what's going to happen, because you're in a dilemma. Either there is some chaos that allows, if you will, freedom to make decisions that are not fully predictable, or everything is predetermined. The materialists would say, oh, it's all in the cards. Not that they could prove that, the universe is a machine and everything could be predictable if we only had enough information and intelligence. But the believers in an all-powerful, omniscient God who knows everything, if God knows everything, that means he knows the future. That means there is nothing you can do to change your fate. Whatever you do, this is what God already foresaw. I remember bringing this up to my very famous Harvard-trained philosophy professor at BYU. And he said, well, God doesn't cause this. He could just foresee things. What people don't understand is, if you believe God is omniscient, if he is 100% sure that you were going to die at age 37 and a half from cancer or whatever it is, or that 3,000 years from now, we're going to meet the Martians. What if anybody can foresee that with 100% accuracy, then it is predetermined. There is no chance for anything else to happen. So the people the fundamentalists who say, well, we have free will, God knows everything in advance, that's not compatible. And so I bring this back to Sheldrake and all the others that want to talk about time travel and how, eventually, we can go faster than light and all these other things. And I don't buy into all that. I think that we're still in kindergarten and we ought to be humble, and let's see what unfolds. I think the real news with the new physics is Radin's approach, which is, how can we apply this? For example, he says, let's say we need to communicate with somebody on the other side of the moon and we can't do it by normal means. Well, if you have a psychic who is trained and you can, maybe they have a headset on the astronaut, maybe you could do that, and you could fix a satellite that is out of control somewhere in the universe, using telepathy or something like that. So I think we need to be humble, unlike the skeptics, and I'm all for innovative thinking, but I'm not quite on board with a lot of the New Age stuff. Well,
that kind of puts you in the camp of a certain type of skeptic, right?
Yes.
But there's a fallacy. Yes, there's a fallacy. There's a fallacy to your argument in most of these arguments, which is everybody starts out with the assumption that God is a person and he's like us. It's an anthropomorphic fallacy. So there's no one person or no one separated mind existing within the cosmos that knows everything. But supposing whatever this thing is the future, it is the past, it embodies the whole thing. That's, I think, more the way I look at it. And so the question is moot as to whether or not some other being in the universe knows everything I'm going to do or you're going to do, whatever. And you can develop it that way. And I don't think there's anything wrong. Now, one thing, for example, with quantum theory and so forth, that I really think is pertinent to this whole thing is the scientists who don't believe in near-death experiences. If you really ask them, they don't believe in experience, period. They don't believe in consciousness. They say, are you conscious? They'll say, no. So, well, I don't have to listen to you because you're just a machine, right? Why should I listen to a machine telling me that I am not conscious? But and that's important, because I think a quantum theory can suggest certain types of thinking. Our unitive experience, which is kind of a one type of thing, sound, sights, everything. You can't say it's any one particular thing, is like a field in science, right? A field which has a certain instantaneous nature, shape, has certain forces within it. And in that sense, and some people say quantum field. So it's kind of a tempting thing. I mean, we can't prove or disprove it yet, but it's a model, it's a theory to keep in mind. So from that standpoint, if you want to be conservative scientific, I think it's allowable to have theories. And Sheldrake's gone beyond just mere theories. He has experimental evidence and he has a theory, and the theory kind of checks out. So I think in terms of the 100th monkey thing, I think he's got at least somewhat got the goods.
Yeah, I would just say, I was addressing obviously the theists who believe that there's no conflict between God, who does know everything, and then it raises the question. It raises the question of, why did he create us if he already knew what the end was, and he already knew that 40% of Europe was going to die from the Black Plague, and a quarter of all humanity was going to die in childhood. It almost sounds like he sounds like Jehovah. He's cruel, sadistic, capricious, doesn't really care about the little mortals, but boy, does he love ever playing God. And he's played this video game before, apparently. He knows how it's going to end, but he likes doing it anyway. He likes playing the video game over and over.
Well, how about careless, and it's not a he, remember? If it's not a he, it's not a person. If it's not somebody like you and me said, all right, I'm going to create a universe. Oh, those guys are going to suffer. I mean, if it's something like say I'm the glorious oneness, and they say, I'm bored, and I'll blast myself in 1,000 pieces carelessly, and then all these and I'll set some rules up, and then I'll just forget it all and see what happens. In the end, when all the pieces come back together, then he can review the results and say, oh my God, I screwed this up, and oh, that was good, and maybe something like that.
Yeah, I mean, the deists would say, oh, God wound up the clock and then just left. Well, the clock's broken. Like if Jehovah or the God of monotheism could foresee all this stuff, how is it that he's created us, including our genetics, our family life, the social evolution, the evolution of technology, nature, and somehow he has no responsibility for it? It's kind of like, okay, I created you guys, here's my magic wand, free will, you're responsible. And then, when you get into discussions with the fundamentalists, they say, well, that's all the fall of human beings because of the fall, and it's like, what?
Well, I agree from the standpoint of the, anthropomorphic God, but he is the clock, and everything that he's done to us, he's actually doing to himself, in my view, at least, being a polysolipsist and all.
He's a sadist and a masochist.
Yeah, at the same time.
And he gave men nipples. Come on.
Yeah, nipples for men. That's right.
Yes. What did you say you were, Vance? A not a
polysolipsist. Polysolipsist.
Tell us what is this?
Okay, well, solipsist is somebody who believes they are the only one in the universe, right? And nobody else exists. Well, a polysolipsist says, okay, start with me. I'm the only person in the universe, or the only being in the universe. But so are you, and so is Scott, and so is Sandra, and so is everybody in the chat room. And we can't understand the true deity, because the true deity is multi-personal. He's multi-being. It's like, and I see it as one being pretending to be a lot of different beings and looking at itself reflexively, like a house of mirrors. And that's what a polysolipsist is. And there's one other person on the whole internet that was ever a polysolipsist that I ever found. So there was two of us, and now he died.
I think
my
Miguel
cousin, and he died.
Okay.
Oh, Miguel, you're muted.
No. Oh my God.
What were you saying?
Could you repeat that last minute? You met another person on the internet.
Yeah, there was one other polysolipsist, and he called himself exactly that. And he goes, "Yeah, wow, this is like what I am." And I wrote to him, and a certain time later, his cousin wrote back and said, "Oh, that was my cousin, and he's dead now." Da, 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 da. So I guess I'm the last one.
The last one standing on this planet. It's like a science fiction movie. And what about you, Sandra? Are you more towards Vance, or are you a nasty dualist Sethian like Scott?
I'm pagan.
Yeah.
You're pagan.
Pagan.
So what does that mean? Everything is alive, everything's divine, or?
How we like to look at it, my dear.
Yeah, she's got a one-person religion, basically. Feminist, Green Tara. We were just talking about ritual and Green Tara and stuff today as we were thinking about, the past interviews we've done. So, but one of the things that is remarkable about her life, and you may have gotten a drift of this from this discussion and prior ones, is she's like magnetized so many really unusual people. She's the one who introduced me to Uri Geller, and I met the psychic Peter Hurkos. Sandra can tell you about
what
those.
It is that I met Peter years before I met Scott. I know Scott for more than 25 years, and Peter was my friend for 20 years, and he was truly, truly, truly the most gifted psychic in the world I've ever encountered. Had a little bit of a language barrier, hard to communicate, but he had clients like the Queen of England and President Reagan. He fell off a ladder in Holland as a young boy, and the moment we woke up from that fall, he had this unbelievable gift. And he brought to America by Andrei Paharish, who brought Uri Geller and Peter here at about the same time. And Uri I knew slightly. I introduced Scott to Uri, but Peter was so unbelievable. He did personal things for me. I used them very graciously. Many personal miraculous readings over the 20-year period. I can go on and on and on about Peter. Nobody like him I've ever encountered in my life, ever. And he was truly, truly the psychic of our century, I would feel. And what did you think of Peter, Scott?
Well, I met him 3 times. She was kind of trying to get me to know him so that he'd give me a reading, but he inconveniently died before that. However, I did hear her stories about how he had the ability, like Bevy Jagers, who I knew quite well, who was a famous psychic in St. Louis, and she helped the police on about 50 cases. And they both had the gift of psychometry, where you can touch an object and you sense its past, present, and future. So she used it for murder trials. Now, there was a lot of propaganda about Peter mistakenly deciding the Boston Strangler case. And then about 10 years ago or so, the LA Times magazine did an investigation, and they concluded, wait a minute, he was actually right. They put the wrong guy in jail. And yet recently the LA Times ran an article about the Boston Strangler case, and they completely ignored that evidence. So, we both had a chance to test Uri Geller. I read James Randi's book and on Geller, and it sounded like he was a fraud, and I was going to do a hard article on him. And Randy warned me about, tricks he uses, like he'll watch the top of your pencil as you're drawing something, and then he'll guess, what you're doing. So I purposely went in the other room, drew something. He was able to guess what it was. And then Sandra took one of her keys that she didn't need anymore, and he famously has bent keys. So I brought this up to one of the skeptics. I said, we went to this, and we were about, 50 feet away or something like that. And there were a bunch of other people there, and we held up this key and we saw it bend. And, Randy, this kind of destroys his argument, which is, these tricksters, they say they want to look at the key, and then they put some kind of chemical on it, and, it gets soft, and then it bends very easily on its own or something like that. So I brought this up to this skeptic, this David Kyle Johnson from the Great Courses. And he said, well, maybe you weren't as far away as you thought you were. It's like, okay, maybe we were 25 feet away, but we brought the key from the home. He'd never seen it, never touched it, and we saw it bent, and so did other people. This just, again, goes to show that, you know, the skeptics cannot accept something that defies what they term reality. So I did some work with Uri, and we tried to write a book together. Actually, he had some UFO experiences, as did Andrea Paharic, who brought him here, and but we got it done in just a little too late. My agent couldn't place it because it was right at the Roswell anniversary. They couldn't understand what we were doing that was different from the others, but he had seen, as Sandra and I have, UFOs, and he wanted to put together a book on the best evidence. And the other books that were out there were on single cases or the entire history of UFOs. So what I ended up doing, and this became chapter 2 of my book, is I spun out these chapters for UFO magazine and then reconstituted them, some of them for my book. And that was really my exposure to the how dishonest the skeptic authorities are.
Wait a second, Scott.
Yeah.
Somebody in the chat, Superfluous Pastry, is saying, just watch Uri Geller's Tonight Show with Johnny Carson episode. That'll tell you everything you need to know about Uri. I never watched it.
Okay,
personally.
so I will answer that.
Okay, please do.
He did not perform as expected. Okay, and I've talked to James Van Praagh and other psychics and Uri about this. You know, people have this notion that psychics are either on and they're 100% right, or they're frauds. You know, it's not that way at all. I have Scott Rogo, the great parapsychologist, compared it. He said psychic ability is like a bad electrical connection. It's not reliable. Sometimes you're on, sometimes you're off. It's just a silly notion that oh, he didn't perform on there. So how does your viewer explain the fact that he bent the key? We were both witnesses. There were like 50 of us in the room, and we each had keys. Okay. Yeah, I read James Randi. I was convinced by James Randi, and the skeptics really can't explain this. So what they got to do is go to Wikipedia, give phony explanations. But going back to what I was saying about UFOs, this is my favorite topic because you can battle over ESP and over near-death experience, but anybody can go to the sources I cite and look at what the skeptics say about UFOs. It doesn't matter whether they're aliens or psychic or whatever, and you will see they lie about what happened because they can't accept the idea that there's something strange out there going on. And incidentally, Uri Geller made a fortune in finding oil and gold and other things. He's a very, very rich guy today from his psychic skills.
Yeah, I have some information right from the horse's mouth. This is just a little bit secondhand, but I've had contact with Russell Targ, and Paharic and Geller were both, worked with Targ and put off at the RV, remote viewing project at SRI. And what Targ told us, I believe this was it was years ago in a mind being seminar, and we got to ask questions. When the subject of Geller came up, he said that he did catch Geller at cheating. However, there were things that Geller did that were definitely, in their opinion, genuine. They could not disprove and so forth. But Geller is a bit of a trickster. And for the sake of impressions, especially like you said, when sometimes the psychic powers aren't right or whatever, and he will fill in magic, and he's a proficient magician as well as a psychic. He will fill in the gaps with magic. So that was Targ's opinion.
Yeah, that's true of all psychics, incidentally. If you go back, I've talked to James Van Praagh and others, and I've observed a lot of these things up close. This is another little thing. You go back into history, involves Houdini and so forth. Even Houdini realized there were things that he couldn't explain. But yes, he did cat tricksters. This comes from what you said, Vance, which is they want to live up to their reputation, and they realize they're not always on. So they will cut corners, and of course that ends up discrediting them. Nevertheless, you read Scott Rogo's Psychic Breakthroughs Today, where he discusses the criticisms of Geller and SRI, and he shows that James Randi's book is just full of utter nonsense.
Interesting. Well, the debate goes on. And any questions from the audience there, Vance?
Oh, lots of them. Let's see if any are along the threads that we're doing.
Yeah, there was a couple. One, now I can't
observers
remember.
have an anti-supernatural charge. In other words, like if a skeptic is in there, they can kind of tamp the psychic abilities, and that's the question that someone's had. What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, I do think that it can have an effect. Listen, if you are, let's assume that there is telepathy and psychic ability. I think all of us have had experiences where we're in a room with people who are really hostile and negative, and we can kind of feel the vibe and stuff. Yes, the psychics are psychically sensitive, and they can feel these things, and it does have a negative impact. I talked about that with James Van Praagh because I spent an hour with him and an hour on the phone observing his group thing. And I said, hey, why don't we go out to the Skeptics in Pasadena while you're here, and why don't you play with their heads? He said the negativity, they think I'm always, trying to get out of this and stuff, but he said they're so hostile, it affects my ability to do this stuff. So people can take it or leave it on the trickster, on the mental effect, but I do think it's a reasonable thing. And this explains why you find tricks, why you find unexplainable accuracy, and why you find wild misses. And Sandra's been with me to test psychics. Most psychics think they are far more accurate than they are. There's the problem right there.
If they didn't, they probably wouldn't do it in the first place, because they have to have confidence, right?
Yep.
The skeptics like Randy was the worst. They do what I call outcome-based research. They start with it's bullshit, and then they work their way backwards, some reasonable sounding, and it's not always reasonable rationale, ignoring a lot of stuff. And, believers do the same thing. So what can you say? We got to keep our eyes open, I guess.
Yeah, it's that old cognitive bias. And what do you call it? Yeah, we look for stuff that will support our ideas. I think, what's the name of the concept? It's not cognitive bias. It's... what is it, Vince?
Confirmation bias.
Thank you. Confirmation bias. Yes. I used to be good at that when I was Orthodox. So sometimes I am. So awesome. And any other more questions from the audience as we are getting towards the end of this Halloween special?
Looks like they've kind of scrolled up. I don't see any recently.
Yeah, we do have a comment about demons.
Sure.
For Halloween, maybe this is a good thing to end on, right?
Let's spook some people.
Yeah, I don't know how many people saw this, but Vanity Fair might have been about a year and a half ago, ran an article on the guy who directed The Exorcist, and he said he had done a book on the Vatican's chief exorcist, a guy named Father Amorth, and he ended up making a documentary, including some filming of some of the ceremonies and stuff. And he took the film in to UCLA neuropsychologists and other experts, and they said they could not explain the things that they saw happen. And so it's called The Devil and Father Amorth. It's not on Netflix yet, but that was a really fascinating thing, because he says that he is an agnostic, and yet he had to witness some very strange things that happened. And I know that Stephan Heller, of the head of the Ecclesia Gnostica, told me that when he was training to be a priest in the Catholic Church as a young man, he went to an exorcism, and he saw the demoniac rise, and this was not a stage trick. So the belief in demons, which is central to Halloween, is really central to virtually every religion. And anybody who thinks that fooling with the supernatural is not risky doesn't understand it. And Sandra also was a witness to something.
Well, yes, a friend of Scott, somebody who was a specialist in designer magic mushroom. I'm talking about designer. I was trying to court him, and he said he had a problem with some kind of unpleasant feeling about some kind of possession. So I introduced him to my teacher, thinking I'd be of service, and the teacher agreed to work with him on one condition, that I help. I did not want to do this. It scared the hell out of me. Absolutely scared me, freaked me out so badly that I'm not a drinker. I drank so much vodka that I blacked out. I don't remember a damn thing about it. I just absolutely don't remember anything about it. I know that it was right here, and the teacher worked with this person. He seemed to have a great deal of relief later. What happened exactly, I don't remember because I wasn't conscious, but it was a very heavy duty experience for the person who I had introduced him to the teacher. Scott can tell you what he thought of what he.
Yeah, no, this guy, a lifelong friend, said that he could feel the release after the ceremony was completed, because he felt that there was some kind of entity kind of sucking his energy and so forth. For years he was telling me about it. So I said, why don't you ask Sandra to talk to the teacher about it? So William Friedkin's, if anybody's interested, you can kind of Google his name, Vanity Fair, the Devil, and Father Amorth. Amorth has since died a year or two ago, I think. But eventually the documentary should come out, and it should be really fascinating. If the UCLA medical experts couldn't explain what happened in the film, I think this will make people think twice before dismissing the idea of possession.
Don't mess with them Archons. They will
question
kick your
for
ass every
Sandra,
time.
by the way.
Yeah, go ahead. One last question before we wrap up. Wrap this
Okay.
up.
Sandra, Trexlex wants to know, would a demon say Satan 3 times, and Trexlex said no 3 times, and then attack him or her and start strangling Trexlex with so much that he popped out of his spirit and then went back to his body? Could a demon do that?
I have no experience. I was not awake for my one exposure. It scared me so much. I didn't want anything to do with it. I was just absolutely freaked out with it. So I don't have firsthand experience. Any comment about that?
Yeah, I mean, Trexlex seems to be referring to something very specific, and sounds like it might have worked. I don't know. But yeah, I just would say in general, don't fool around thinking that entities are all wise and benign and bringers of the truth and everything like that. There's a lot of, this is kind of foundational to Gnosticism, is the concept of the archons and the hostile entities. And people say, that doesn't make any sense. Why would these entities be hostile towards us? How do you explain, the Mao Zedongs of the world? Why do mortals do crazy things and hate us for no reason,
As above, so below. Very simple. But I think we are at the end of this very fun and interactive Halloween special on AM by Live. Yes. I mean, the night has been almost an hour and 40 minutes or so. So, and it's been great. But again, in a few minutes, this will be available on YouTube, as many know. I will be putting the audio version on iTunes, Spotify, and all these other podcatchers tomorrow with an added bonus, which I will let you know about. So it will be available for everyone through the Halloween season. So please enjoy, wear your mask, live your fantasies, embrace your darkness, because the light is within there. And again, I must repeat, we will be changing the private RSS feed for AB Prime members, and please support this show in any way you can. It's growing. Let's keep growing this Red Pill Cafeteria. Let's keep connecting and creating a Gnostic community, because these are important times to wake up as the Archons are bringing the hammer down. Don't know what else can I say. If you can't see this is a Philip K. Dick world and the Gnostic nightmare has come true, then I don't know what to tell you. Have one of the political parties save you or some church save you, because we can't help you. So, but Scott and Sandra, thank you very much for coming on our special for a very stimulating and excellent interview, as always.
We appreciate the opportunity. It's always fun.
Awesome. And for the audience, thank you so much for appearing. Love your questions, good comments. Good comments, some strange comments, but I kind of like the strange comments more than the good comments, because it makes me think. And yeah, a lot of people will bring up Donnie Darko and Vance on Advance. So that was awesome. The perfect vibe for Aeon Bide. So on this Halloween special, I want Vance to have the last word. And Vance, thanks for being us and always being the anchor that keeps this show grounded in any sort of logic or reason.
Oh gosh, that's a hell of an accusation to a heretic, but
yes.
It's always fun. It's always a pleasure. And everybody out there, keep away from those Quarkons. They'll get you every time.
That's great. Yes, we got to have a pun before we leave the night.
Absolutely.
So anyway, thank you very much for everybody. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being yourself here at the Virtual Alexandria and Aeon Bite Gnostic Radio. Hello and goodbye, and everybody have a happy Halloween.